The war has narrowed the world into a series of hard edges and final moments. For the man at the center of this opening, everything that once gave shape to his life has been stripped away by noise, exhaustion, and defeat. The title's image of him closing his eyes is not a dramatic gesture but an instinctive one, learned through months of survival under constant threat. It is the reflex of someone who has seen enough to know what usually comes next. In his mind, capture does not mean pause or reflection. It means punishment, humiliation, and pain delivered without explanation. He is not imagining this outcome out of cowardice, but out of experience shaped by a war that has taught him mercy is an illusion. The environment around him reinforces that certainty. The air is heavy with the residue of conflict. Smoke clinging to clothing, mud pressed into fabric and skin, the metallic scent of spent ammunition lingering long after the firing has stopped. His body bears the marks of prolonged strain, hunger that has hollowed him, fatigue that has blurred days into one continuous stretch of endurance. Every sensation feels muted yet sharp at the same time, as if his nerves are braced for impact. When restraint comes, whether by rope, hand, or command, it confirms what he already believes. The future has collapsed into the next few seconds, and those seconds promise suffering. This expectation is not only personal, it is ideological. Long before this moment, he was trained to believe that the enemy embodied cruelty, that surrender meant disgrace followed by retribution. Stories circulated through barracks and trenches, reinforced by speeches and whispers alike, painted captivity as a fate worse than death. Those narratives were not abstract propaganda but survival tools, designed to harden resolve and suppress doubt. Now, standing defeated, those same stories turn against him, filling the silence with dread. Closing his eyes becomes an act of self-protection, a way to meet pain without witnessing it, to preserve the last fragments of dignity by refusing to look. Psychologically, this moment represents total surrender. It is not merely the laying down of arms but the acceptance that agency has ended. His identity, once tied to rank, unit, and cause, has been reduced to a body awaiting consequence. In war, such moments are often described as decisive, but for the individual they are profoundly passive. Nothing he does now can alter what is about to happen. The choice to close his eyes acknowledges that power has shifted completely, and that resistance, even internal, feels futile. It is the quiet defeat that follows the loud one on the battlefield. Yet embedded in this stillness is the larger machinery of war, unseen but ever-present. His capture is not an isolated event but part of a vast system of advance and retreat, of victories measured in territory and casualties. To history, he is a minor figure, one among countless others processed through the mechanisms of conflict. But in this instant, the war is intensely personal. Every grand strategy has narrowed into the question of whether the next touch will be a blow or something worse. The enormity of global conflict compresses into a single human expectation: pain. There is also shame intertwined with fear. Defeat carries moral weight in wartime cultures that glorify endurance and sacrifice. Even as he anticipates physical suffering, he wrestles with the idea that he has failed to hold a position, to protect comrades, to live up to the ideals instilled in him. This internal judgment is as punishing as anything he expects from his captors. Closing his eyes allows him to withdraw from that scrutiny as well, to escape, if only briefly, the sense of being seen as weak or broken. It is a retreat inward, where blame and fear merge. The title frames this moment deliberately because it represents the baseline from which everything else will be measured. Expecting pain is the emotional ground zero of the narrative. It establishes a world in which cruelty is normalized, where the logic of war has erased alternatives. At this point, there is no room for surprise, no expectation of complexity. The enemy is a fixed concept, defined by violence and dominance. Any deviation from that script has not yet entered his awareness. The closed eyes symbolize certainty, not hope. This certainty has been reinforced by what he has witnessed throughout the war. He has seen villages reduced to rubble, prisoners marched away under gunpoint, civilians caught between advancing fronts. Violence has been both tool and message, used to assert control and spread fear. In such a landscape, gentleness seems not just unlikely but incompatible with survival. To expect pain is to align with the only consistent pattern he has observed. It is the safest assumption in an unsafe world. Even time behaves differently in this moment. Seconds stretch, heavy and indistinct, as if the universe itself is holding its breath. Without sight, his other senses sharpen, cataloging sounds and movements for signs of what is coming. Boots on the ground, the rustle of fabric, the murmur of unfamiliar language, all are interpreted through the lens of fear. Each sound feels like a precursor, each pause like a deliberate cruelty meant to heighten anticipation. The absence of immediate violence does not bring relief, it intensifies anxiety, because it breaks expectation without offering explanation. What makes this opening so powerful is its ordinariness. There is nothing heroic in closing one's eyes in defeat. It is a deeply human response, shared across borders and uniforms. By centering this reaction, the narrative strips away abstraction and forces the viewer to inhabit vulnerability. The war is not introduced through strategy or ideology, but through the internal collapse of one individual who believes he knows exactly how this story ends. That belief is absolute, shaped by everything the war has taught him so far. At this stage, there is no moral ambiguity from his perspective. The roles are fixed, victor and defeated, punisher and punished. His expectation of pain confirms the moral universe he has been living in, one where power expresses itself through suffering. This worldview has allowed him to endure, to make sense of brutality by assuming it is universal and inevitable. If everyone behaves this way, then nothing is broken. It is simply how the world works. Closing his eyes is a final affirmation of that logic. Time does not move forward in the way he expects. Instead of the sharp punctuation of violence, there is a strange, disorienting pause. The moment after surrender stretches into something undefined, as if the war itself has hesitated. For a man who has closed his eyes to brace for pain, this delay is deeply unsettling. Silence, in this context, is not comforting. It feels deliberate, even calculated, as though the suffering he anticipates is being postponed to make it worse. His body remains rigid, every muscle locked in readiness, unable to relax because the expected blow has not yet arrived. Without sight, he becomes acutely aware of his own breathing, shallow and uneven, betraying fear he no longer has the strength to suppress. Each breath feels too loud, too exposed. He listens for the sounds that usually accompany punishment: shouted orders, hurried movements, the unmistakable tension of imminent violence. Instead, what reaches him is measured and restrained. Footsteps do not rush toward him, they stop at a respectful distance. There is no barked command demanding speed or obedience, no strike meant to assert dominance. The absence of these familiar cues introduces a new kind of fear, one born from uncertainty rather than expectation. His mind struggles to interpret what is happening. War has conditioned him to read situations quickly, to identify threats and respond without hesitation. Now, those instincts fail him. The delay does not fit the patterns he knows. He wonders if this is some form of psychological cruelty, a way to prolong dread by withholding the inevitable. In his experience, mercy is rarely immediate. Suffering often comes after a moment of false calm. This thought tightens his chest, reinforcing his decision to keep his eyes shut, to deny his captors the satisfaction of witnessing his fear. As seconds turn into minutes, the physical sensations of restraint begin to register more clearly. The pressure around his wrists or arms is firm but not crushing. It holds him in place without the unnecessary cruelty he has come to associate with capture. This detail unsettles him more than rough handling would have. He cannot reconcile gentleness with defeat. To him, control has always been demonstrated through excess force, through the reminder that the captor's power is absolute and unchallenged. The restraint he feels now communicates authority without aggression, and that contradiction gnaws at his understanding of how war operates. Around him, the environment continues to assert itself in subtle ways. The sounds of the battlefield have receded, replaced by the low murmur of activity that suggests order rather than chaos. Equipment is handled carefully, not thrown or slammed. Movements are efficient, almost routine, as if his presence is not an opportunity for revenge but simply another task to be completed. This normalcy is deeply disorienting. He has imagined this moment countless times, but never like this. The script in his head does not match the reality unfolding around him. The longer nothing happens, the more his anticipation of pain transforms into something else, confusion layered with a creeping sense of disbelief. His fear does not disappear, but it loses its sharp edge, becoming diffuse and exhausting. Maintaining terror requires constant reinforcement, and the lack of overt threat begins to erode his certainty. He remains on edge, but now his thoughts start to wander, probing for explanations. Is this a temporary calm before brutality, or has he misunderstood something fundamental about his situation? Internally, he resists the latter possibility. Accepting that his expectations might be wrong feels dangerous, even naive. In war, false hope can be fatal. He has learned to distrust anything that resembles kindness, especially when it comes from the enemy. To reinterpret this delay as anything other than preparation for harm would be to lower his guard, and that feels like an unacceptable risk. His mind clings to fear because fear, at least, has been reliable. It has kept him alive this long. Yet the delay continues, and with it comes an unintended intimacy. Being forced to wait, unable to act or see, traps him in his own thoughts. Memories surface unbidden, earlier captures he has witnessed, men dragged away, faces contorted with pain or defiance. Those images clash with the present moment, creating cognitive dissonance. If this situation is the same, why does it feel so different? The question lingers, unresolved, because he lacks the evidence to answer it. The people around him do not treat the moment as a spectacle. There is no audience, no ritualized display of dominance. Whatever is happening appears procedural, governed by rules rather than impulse. This realization unsettles him profoundly. Rules imply limits, and limits imply restraint. In his understanding of war, restraint has always been temporary, something discarded when emotions run high. Yet here, restraint seems to be the default state. The enemy's power is not being asserted through chaos but through control. Physically, the tension begins to take its toll. Holding himself rigid becomes painful, his muscles aching from sustained contraction. Fear, once an adrenaline-fueled force, starts to drain him instead. He wants the moment to resolve, one way or another, because the waiting is unbearable. Pain, at least, would be definitive. It would confirm his worldview and allow him to endure what comes next with grim acceptance. The ambiguity is far worse, because it forces him to remain mentally engaged, questioning assumptions he would rather leave unexamined. At some point, he becomes aware of small, almost mundane details: the sound of wind moving through damaged structures, the distant call of a bird returning to a landscape scarred by fighting. These details feel out of place, intruding on what he believes should be a moment of pure violence. They remind him that the world continues beyond his fear, indifferent to his internal crisis. This realization adds another layer to his disorientation. The war, which has felt all-encompassing, suddenly seems capable of coexisting with quiet and order, even in the presence of a defeated enemy. Emotionally, this chapter is defined by suspension. Nothing has been resolved, but something has been destabilized. His expectation of pain remains, but it is no longer unchallenged. The delay forces him into a liminal state, caught between what he believes and what he is experiencing. He has not yet opened his eyes, either literally or metaphorically, but the certainty that allowed him to close them in the first place is beginning to weaken. This moment does not yet offer relief or hope. Instead, it introduces doubt, which in many ways is more unsettling than fear. Doubt requires engagement. It demands that he consider alternatives he has been trained to reject. As long as he expected pain, the moral universe of the war remained simple and brutal. With each passing second of gentleness or neutrality, that simplicity erodes. The enemy's silence and restraint are not acts of mercy yet, but they are deviations, and deviations in wartime carry enormous psychological weight. When his eyes finally open, the world that greets him does not align with the one he has been bracing for. There is no sudden explosion of violence to justify his fear, no dramatic confirmation that his expectations were correct. Instead, what unfolds is something quieter and far more destabilizing. British gentleness does not announce itself with words or gestures meant to impress. It reveals itself through ordinary actions carried out with deliberate calm. The handling of his body is careful, almost impersonal, as if he is not an object of hatred but a responsibility. This subtle shift in treatment forces him to confront a reality he has not prepared for. The first tangible sign is practical rather than symbolic. His restraints are adjusted not to tighten control but to prevent discomfort. There is attention paid to his physical state, an assessment that feels clinical rather than predatory. Hands move with efficiency, not aggression. In a war defined by excess force, this restraint feels almost alien. He searches the faces around him for signs of deception or malice, expecting to find cruelty masked by patience, but what he sees instead is focus and professionalism. The men overseeing him appear absorbed in procedure, not vengeance. Food appears, offered without ceremony. It is not a feast, not an act of generosity meant to overwhelm, but a basic acknowledgement of his humanity. Hunger, long suppressed by adrenaline and fear, surges forward the moment he realizes what is being placed in front of him. Accepting it feels dangerous, as though doing so might signal weakness or compliance. Yet refusing would serve no purpose. When he eats, the act feels surreal, almost transgressive, because it contradicts everything he has been taught about what capture entails. Nourishment from the enemy challenges the narrative that has sustained him through months of hardship. Medical attention follows in the same understated manner. Wounds that have gone untreated out of necessity are examined with a level of care he has not expected. Pain is acknowledged, not exploited. Bandages are applied with precision, movements practiced and efficient. There is no commentary, no attempt to extract gratitude or submission. The treatment is offered because it is required, because the system governing his captivity demands it. This is perhaps the most unsettling aspect. Kindness that is not personal, not emotional, but institutional. As these actions accumulate, their combined effect begins to register. Individually, each gesture could be dismissed as strategy or manipulation. Together, they form a pattern that is harder to ignore. This is not mercy granted as an exception, it is restraint exercised as a rule. The realization creeps in slowly, resisted at every step. He has been conditioned to believe that the enemy operates outside moral boundaries, that cruelty is not just common but necessary. Confronted with evidence to the contrary, his mind struggles to reconcile belief with experience. The psychological impact is profound. Fear does not vanish, but it loses its coherence. Without immediate threat, his emotions lose their anchor. He finds himself watching details he would normally ignore. The way instructions are given quietly rather than shouted, the absence of insults or slurs, the efficiency with which tasks are completed. Even eye contact, when it occurs, lacks the hostility he expects. He is not looked at as a defeated foe to be broken, but as a prisoner to be managed. This shift forces him inward. For the first time since his capture, he is not entirely consumed by survival instinct. Space opens for reflection, and with it comes discomfort. If the enemy behaves this way, what does that imply about the stories he has believed? Propaganda has painted British forces as ruthless and hypocritical, preaching civility while practicing cruelty. Yet here, on the ground, the reality appears more complex. The discrepancy unsettles him because it undermines the moral clarity that war relies upon. He begins to realize that gentleness, in this context, is not softness. It is controlled, disciplined, and backed by overwhelming power. The men guarding him do not need to prove dominance through violence. It is already established. Their restraint feels intentional, almost strategic, as if they are asserting a different kind of authority, one rooted in order rather than fear. This understanding is deeply uncomfortable. It suggests that cruelty is not inevitable, that violence is a choice rather than a necessity. With this realization comes an unexpected sense of vulnerability. Pain was something he knew how to endure. Confusion is far more difficult to manage. He finds himself questioning not only the enemy's behavior but his own role in the war. If they can afford to treat him humanely, what does that say about the way he has been taught to view them? And by extension, what does it say about the actions he and his comrades have taken under the assumption that brutality was universal? Memory intrudes again, but now it functions differently. Earlier recollections of violence no longer reinforce certainty, they contrast with the present, creating moral friction. He recalls moments when prisoners were treated harshly on his own side, justified as necessary or deserved. Those memories now feel heavier, stripped of their rationalizations. The gentleness he is experiencing does not absolve anyone, but it reframes responsibility. It implies that alternatives existed, even in the most extreme conditions. Despite this internal upheaval, nothing dramatic occurs externally. The British gentleness remains steady, unremarkable in its consistency. There is no moment of overt compassion meant to inspire gratitude or loyalty. The lack of emotional display reinforces the sense that this behavior is normalized, not exceptional. He is not being spared out of pity, he is being processed according to standards that exist independently of him. That distinction matters. It transforms kindness from a personal gift into a moral position. Gradually his posture changes. The rigid tension that defined his initial capture eases, replaced by cautious alertness. He remains aware of his status as a prisoner, of the imbalance of power, but he no longer expects immediate harm. This adjustment feels risky, as though he is betraying a core survival instinct. Yet his body responds despite his resistance, shoulders lowering, breathing slowing. His nervous system, long locked in fight or flight, begins to recalibrate. Emotionally, this chapter represents the emergence of cognitive dissonance as a driving force. The enemy is no longer a monolithic source of fear. Instead, they become agents of a system that contradicts his assumptions. This does not lead to admiration or trust, but it does erode hatred. Hatred requires simplification, and simplicity is becoming harder to maintain. The war, once divided cleanly into good and evil, now appears layered with contradictions. The gentleness he encounters also redefines strength. Strength, he has learned, is measured by endurance and aggression, by the capacity to inflict and withstand suffering. What he witnesses challenges that definition. Here, strength is demonstrated through restraint, through adherence to principles even when cruelty would be easier. This interpretation is deeply destabilizing because it suggests that moral discipline can coexist with military power. The implication is not comforting, it demands accountability. By the end of this chapter, he has not reached any grand conclusion. His loyalties have not shifted, and the war has not softened in his mind. What has changed is subtler but no less significant. The enemy has acquired depth. British gentleness has introduced complexity into a worldview built on absolutes. The man who once closed his eyes in certainty now keeps them open, not because he feels safe, but because he needs to understand what he is seeing. As the initial shock of unexpected treatment fades, a deeper and more unsettling process begins. The gentleness he has encountered does not remain an isolated incident. It persists, consistent enough to demand interpretation. What first felt like an anomaly now stretches into duration, and duration turns behavior into meaning. With each hour that passes without cruelty, the internal defenses he built to survive begin to erode, not because he wants them to, but because they no longer align with reality. The war has taught him to endure pain, not to question its absence. This prolonged restraint forces him into a confrontation with himself. In the absence of immediate threat, his mind drifts toward reflection, a luxury he has not been able to afford for a long time. He becomes acutely aware of how much of his identity has been constructed around expectation of violence. Fear has been his compass, guiding decisions and justifying actions. Now, without that constant pressure, he feels unmoored. The quiet professionalism of his captors leaves him alone with thoughts he would rather suppress. Control, he realizes, is still absolute, but it manifests differently. He is told where to go, when to stop, when to eat, yet none of these commands are accompanied by humiliation. Compliance is assumed, not enforced through pain. This form of authority unsettles him more than brutality ever did. Violence would allow him to retreat into victimhood, to endure suffering as proof of righteousness or sacrifice. Order strips him of that refuge. It demands presence and awareness, forcing him to acknowledge his situation without the numbing buffer of trauma. As he observes the routines around him, patterns emerge. Prisoners are accounted for, not displayed. Guards rotate shifts with practiced regularity, their demeanor unchanged regardless of who stands before them. There is no visible pleasure taken in power. This absence of emotional engagement makes the system feel impersonal, but not indifferent. It is designed to function regardless of individual feelings. That realization introduces a disturbing thought, that humanity here is not accidental, but engineered. This idea challenges his understanding of moral choice in war. He has always believed that extreme conditions inevitably erode ethics, that survival necessitates cruelty. Yet what he witnesses contradicts that belief. Ethics, it seems, have been institutionalized rather than abandoned. The rules governing his captivity do not erase his enemy's power, they channel it. The result is a form of dominance that does not rely on terror to sustain itself. This forces him to reconsider whether brutality is truly unavoidable or merely convenient. Internally, shame begins to surface in a new form. Earlier, it was tied to defeat and failure. Now it is linked to comparison. He remembers moments when restraint could have been exercised on his own side, but was not. Those memories resurface with uncomfortable clarity, stripped of their wartime justifications. The gentleness he is experiencing acts as a mirror, reflecting back actions he once accepted without question. This reflection is not imposed by accusation. It arises organically from contrast. The psychological reversal is gradual but relentless. Fear gives way to a cautious respect, not for individuals, but for the system that governs them. This respect is unwanted. It threatens his sense of allegiance and the moral certainty that sustained him through loss and hardship. Respecting the enemy feels like betrayal, yet denying what he sees feels dishonest. Caught between these impulses, he exists in a state of internal tension that is harder to endure than physical pain. The war, once framed as a clash of absolutes, begins to fracture into shades of responsibility and choice. He recognizes that the enemy's restraint does not absolve them of violence elsewhere, nor does it negate the destruction caused by the conflict. But it does complicate the narrative that all sides are equally brutal by necessity. This complication is dangerous to a soldier's psyche. War depends on simplification to function. Complexity undermines resolve. As days pass, the cumulative effect of gentleness alters his behavior. He speaks when addressed, follows instructions without the reflexive hostility he once felt. This change alarms him. He worries that adaptation might be mistaken for acceptance, that survival within this system might slowly erode his sense of opposition. Yet resistance, in this context, seems performative, stripped of purpose. There is no cruelty to push back against, no injustice to visibly defy. The absence of abuse robs him of a clear adversarial stance. Emotionally, this chapter is marked by an inversion of power dynamics as he understands them. Power is no longer expressed through spectacle or fear, but through consistency and predictability. The guards do not need to assert dominance because the structure itself does so. This realization reframes captivity not as a personal humiliation, but as a bureaucratic condition. While still dehumanizing in its own way, it lacks the personal malice that fuels hatred. The gentleness also reintroduces time as a factor in his consciousness. Pain compresses time, forcing focus onto the immediate. Without it, the future reappears, undefined but present. He begins to wonder what comes next, not just in terms of survival, but in terms of meaning. If he survives this war, what will he carry with him? The question lingers uncomfortably, because the experiences shaping him now do not fit neatly into narratives of heroism or martyrdom. At moments, resentment flares. He resents being forced into moral reflection by circumstances beyond his control. He resents the enemy for behaving in a way that destabilizes his beliefs. Gentleness, he realizes, can be a form of power precisely because it denies the other side the comfort of hatred. Hatred simplifies suffering. Without it, suffering becomes ambiguous, harder to justify and harder to endure. This internal conflict does not resolve into clarity or peace. Instead, it deepens. He becomes more aware of the fragility of the values he once held as absolute. They were sustained by repetition and reinforcement, not by exposure to alternatives. Now exposed, they waver. This does not mean he abandons them, but they no longer feel invincible. The war's moral landscape has expanded, and he is struggling to orient himself within it. Memory becomes the dominant force shaping his inner world now, not as escape, but as comparison. With the immediacy of fear reduced, the past presses in with renewed clarity. Scenes he once recalled selectively, filtered through justification and necessity, now return in fuller detail. He remembers prisoners herded roughly, not because it was required, but because it was easier. He recalls the tone of voices hardened by habit, the casualness with which suffering was accepted as background noise. At the time, these moments blended seamlessly into the logic of war. Now, placed beside the restraint he is experiencing, they feel heavier, stripped of the moral insulation that once protected him from doubt. The contrast sharpens his awareness of choice. The war had taught him that violence spreads outward, that once unleashed it becomes uncontrollable, consuming everyone equally. Yet what he is witnessing suggests otherwise. Violence can be regulated. It can be contained, directed, even limited by principle. This realization does not erase the devastation he knows the enemy has caused elsewhere, but it challenges the belief that brutality is always an unavoidable byproduct of conflict. The idea that suffering could have been reduced, even marginally, unsettles him more than the suffering itself ever did. With this comes a new form of guilt, quieter but more persistent than the shame of defeat. It is not tied to a single action or failure, but to participation. He wonders how many moments passed where restraint was possible and simply not chosen. The war demanded obedience, yes, but it also relied on individuals to carry out its logic without constant supervision. He had accepted that logic without resistance, telling himself that everyone did the same. The gentleness he encounters now undermines that assumption, suggesting that collective behavior is shaped by standards, not inevitability. This gentleness does not present itself as forgiveness or absolution. No one speaks to him about morality or reconciliation. There is no attempt to win his loyalty or reshape his beliefs overtly. That absence makes the experience more powerful. It forces reflection without guidance, leaving him alone with his conclusions. The enemy's restraint becomes an implicit statement rather than an argument, and implicit statements are harder to dismiss. They do not demand agreement, they simply exist. As days pass, he notices how this environment affects not only him but others around him. Fellow prisoners exhibit similar patterns of adjustment. Initial hostility fades into guarded neutrality. Conversations, when they occur, revolve less around revenge fantasies and more around logistics, survival, and the future. This shift is not driven by optimism, but by the gradual recognition that suffering is not being escalated for its own sake. The collective atmosphere changes subtly, shaped by predictability and order rather than fear. The system governing his captivity reveals itself as something deliberate and maintained. Rules are enforced consistently, not arbitrarily. Violations are addressed without spectacle. This consistency communicates a kind of moral confidence. It suggests that restraint is not situational, but foundational. For him, this is perhaps the most destabilizing element of all. If restraint can be institutionalized here, then the argument that war inevitably strips away humanity loses credibility. He begins to understand that gentleness, in this context, functions as a quiet indictment. It does not accuse, but it exposes. It highlights the gap between what is possible and what is often chosen. This realization forces him to confront uncomfortable questions about responsibility. Not just the responsibility of leaders or ideologies, but of individuals operating within them. He had believed that moral agency was suspended in war, replaced by necessity. Now, that belief feels less defensible. Emotionally, this stage is marked by a sense of dislocation. He no longer fits neatly into the narrative he carried into captivity. Hatred feels less accessible, not because it has been disproven, but because it no longer explains his experience. Yet admiration or trust feel equally inappropriate. He exists in a space between condemnation and understanding, unsure where to anchor his identity. This ambiguity is exhausting. Certainty, even violent certainty, would be easier to bear. The passage of time reinforces the shift. Without constant trauma to anchor memory, moments blur together. The war recedes slightly from the forefront of his consciousness, replaced by routines that feel almost mundane. This mundanity is unsettling in its own way. It suggests continuity, a future that extends beyond immediate survival. He begins to imagine himself not just as a soldier or a prisoner, but as someone who will have to live with memory. The thought carries weight. Memory shaped by contrast is harder to compartmentalize. At times, resentment resurfaces in unexpected ways. He resents the enemy for forcing him into this moral reckoning. He resents the gentleness precisely because it complicates his suffering. Pain would have allowed him to endure without questioning. Kindness, restrained and impersonal, demands engagement. It denies him the simplicity of victimhood and the comfort of righteous anger. This resentment does not erupt outwardly, it simmers internally, another layer of conflict added to the war he thought he understood. He also becomes aware of how language changes in this environment. Orders are clear, functional, devoid of insult. Names are replaced by numbers or roles, which dehumanizes in one sense but avoids personal degradation. This paradox adds to his confusion. Dehumanization without cruelty feels different, less corrosive, but still incomplete. It reinforces the idea that humanity here is preserved through limits rather than intimacy. He is not embraced, but he is not brutalized. The distinction matters. As his internal narrative shifts, he begins to see the war less as a clash of nations and more as a test of systems. Systems that encourage cruelty produce cruelty. Systems that enforce restraint produce restraint. This perspective does not absolve anyone, but it redistributes responsibility. It suggests that moral outcomes are shaped long before individuals reach moments of crisis. This understanding is sobering. It implies that what he once accepted as fate was, in many ways, designed. By the end of this chapter, the gentleness he has encountered has fully transformed from surprise into moral reference point. It does not dominate his thoughts, but it frames them. Every memory of violence now passes through this lens, altered by the knowledge that alternatives existed. This knowledge does not bring peace. Instead, it introduces a lasting tension that will not be resolved by the end of the war. The final stage of this experience does not arrive with resolution or relief, but with a quieter, more enduring transformation. By now, the expectation of pain that once defined his captivity has dissolved completely, replaced not by comfort, but by an altered understanding of what power, survival, and humanity can look like under extreme conditions. The war continues beyond the boundaries of his confinement, violent and unyielding, yet within him something has shifted permanently. He is no longer waiting for cruelty. That waiting once gave structure to his fear. Without it, he must confront the reality of what he has learned. What lingers most is not gratitude, but awareness. British gentleness has not saved him in any dramatic sense. It has not restored freedom, erased loss, or justified the suffering of the war. Instead, it has imposed a moral weight that is difficult to carry. He now understands that humanity can persist even when circumstances seem designed to extinguish it. This understanding is not comforting. It introduces responsibility where he once believed there was none. If restraint is possible here, then it was possible elsewhere, at other times, in other hands. As his captivity progresses, he becomes increasingly aware that this experience will outlast the war itself. Battles end, uniforms are discarded, but memory remains. He senses that when he returns to civilian life, if he returns at all, this period will resist simplification. He will not be able to describe it easily, not to himself and certainly not to others. The story does not conform to expectations of victimhood or heroism. It occupies an uncomfortable middle ground, shaped by contradiction rather than clarity. The gentleness he encountered has altered how he perceives strength. Strength, he now realizes, is not only the ability to endure suffering or impose it, but the discipline to restrain oneself when restraint is difficult. This insight undermines the narratives that glorified unchecked force and emotional hardening. It reframes courage as something quieter and less visible, expressed through consistency rather than spectacle. This redefinition unsettles him because it forces a re-evaluation of who, in the war, truly possessed power. He also becomes aware of the fragility of this gentleness. It exists within a system maintained by rules and accountability, not by instinct. Without that structure, it could collapse. This realization prevents idealization. He does not romanticize his captors or the system they represent. He understands that this restraint is conditional, dependent on discipline and oversight. That understanding makes it more impressive, not less. It demonstrates that moral behavior in war is not accidental, but constructed and defended. As time passes, the intensity of reflection settles into something steadier. The constant questioning gives way to acceptance of ambiguity. He stops searching for definitive answers about right and wrong, focusing instead on acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the war was not morally uniform. Acknowledgement that individuals and systems made choices that shaped outcomes beyond the battlefield. This acceptance does not resolve his inner conflict, but it allows him to carry it without being consumed by it. He begins to notice changes in himself that feel subtle but significant. He listens more than he speaks. He reacts less instinctively, more deliberately. These shifts are not born of obedience or submission, but of recalibration. His internal compass, once oriented entirely around fear and resistance, now accounts for complexity. This does not make him passive. It makes him attentive. Attentiveness, he realizes, is a form of agency that survives even in captivity.